The Southwestern Company presents My Fun with Reading.
Book 5, Stories about Space and Earth Science.
Open Book 5 to the Contents page. You'll see that the stories in this book are Journey to the Edge of Space, Painting the Past, and Recycling with Sally.
On the last page of each story are 2 word lists. What does it mean, and how do you say it? That's where you go if you're having trouble with hard words.
Whenever you hear this sound, please turn the page. Let's try it.
Now you should be on the page that says, Journey to the Edge of Space. Are you ready to read? Here we go!
Journey to the Edge of Space. The clock was ticking. Launch time was 6 minutes away, but the crew members aboard the space station Legacy sat calmly in front of their stations, absorbed in their work. Around the room, the shiny control panels flashed and buzzed. The talk of the busy crew hummed over the click of switches, the whine of motors, and the tapping of computer keys. In the center of the room, a remote team member, arms thrust into black rubber gloves in a clear dome, analyzed soil samples. Off to one side, the life support team peered at the murky contents of a test tube. In a glass-enclosed area, another team assembled sections of a probe about to be launched into the tail of Comet Halley. Its purpose? To send back information about our universe. Nearby, a viewing screen showed clouds swirling above the globe of the Earth. Far beneath the clouds, on the Earth's surface, was Mission Control. There, team members checked their monitors to make sure things were going smoothly on the space station. Sarah, one of the life support team, stared in shock at her monitor. "Tim," she called to a teammate, "if these numbers are right, the entire space station crew is in trouble." Tim's stool screeched as he rushed to join her. "Why? What's wrong?" "See these figures?" said Sarah, pointing to her screen. "They measure oxygen pressure in the cabin." She punched in a set of numbers on her calculator. "It's way too low for a crew of 16. Tim tapped at his calculator. "I sure hope it's a computer error, or in about 4 minutes the crew will start to lose consciousness." "Which means we have only 3 minutes to figure this out," Sarah said. She scribbled a message for Ben. Known as Capcom, he handled communications for Mission Control. Ben tried to keep his voice calm as he contacted Simcom, the specialist in communications on board Space Station Legacy. "Capcom to Simcom, I have an urgent message. Over." A voice crackled over the little speaker on Ben's control panel. "Simcom to Capcom, we are ready to receive. Over." The computer shows dangerously low oxygen levels on board. "Are you picking up any problems on your oxygen flow display? Over." As they waited for a response, Sarah and Tim looked at the monitors to keep track of the time. It was only last night that Sarah was looking up into the inky sky, wondering why she had been chosen for life support. After all, spaceflight and its support had always been an adventure for adults, and Sarah's own adulthood seemed as far away as those tiny stars above her. Yet here she was in the year 2061, responsible for the health and safety of an entire crew as they readied themselves for a rendezvous with Comet Halley. The little speaker hissed back to life. "Simcom to Capcom, I have a message for life support. Do you read me? Over." "Life support is ready to receive," said Ben. "Over." "Our computers are showing a leak in valve number 1, and the number 3 opening is stuck in the off position. Can you advise? Over." Advise? Sarah could only shrug her shoulders. "Ben, I have to get the flight director. Can you tell Legacy we're working on it?" Sarah quickly explained the problem to the flight director. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said. but I don't think I can help you." He put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I know you can solve this problem, Sarah. The whole crew's depending on you. Besides," he added, "you come so very highly recommended." As he walked away, Sarah's stomach turned a somersault. Ben and Tim looked up eagerly as she returned. Sarah swallowed hard, then asked, "Tim, will you figure out how much oxygen is needed for the crew size? I need more information." She wrote out another message. Ben read it into the microphone. "Capcom to Simcom. Life support controllers need close-up visuals of your oxygen flow display. Can you provide? Over." "Roger, Capcom. We are positioning the camera now. Over." Instantly, red and green lights dotted the video screen. At first, it was only a jumble of boxes, tubes, and numbered lights. Sarah sat in front of the monitor with her chin in her hands. How was she supposed to make sense of this in just 2 minutes? She tried to concentrate. "Now, if this route is leaking," she mumbled, "we have to close this section off. And that valve is stuck shut, so we have to find another passage. Maybe through there." To Sarah's growing amazement, a pattern began to emerge. She sketched out her ideas, closing off some valves and opening others. Sarah sat back and stared at her plan. She had just plotted a brand new path for the oxygen. Tim added his calculations to her diagram, and she handed it to Ben. "Capcom to Simcom," said Ben. "We are sending you a diagram of the revised oxygen flow. It shows which new valves to activate. Pressure settings are also included. Please advise us of your progress. Over." Ben and Sarah looked up at the mission status monitor. If the probe wasn't launched in exactly 4 minutes, the Legacy would miss the precise launch angle calculated by the navigation team. The speaker buzzed with the background chatter of the Legacy crew. Then, "Simcom to Capcom. Oxygen system is repaired. Thanks for your help. Over." Ben hooted and gave Sarah and Tim a high five. As Sarah and her teammates went back to their monitors, work on board the Legacy continued. The comet's location was verified. One of the monitors showed holes in the meteoroid shield, and a robot was sent to get it. One of the space station's cameras was trained on the probe team as they assembled the last components of the device. If the probe went off course, scientists would have to wait another 76 years for Comet Halley to come close enough for another try. The mission commander walked up to the cabin microphone. "Attention, Legacy crew. There are 2 minutes left to Comet Rendezvous. Please finish your jobs and close up your stations." The probe team bent over the probe's metal casing as they plugged in the last few pieces of equipment. A team member pushed in the sliding drawer to ready the probe for launch. The 1-minute countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ignition. A black metal bar locked into place over the probe drawer. All eyes moved to the flight monitor. A single light flashed across the screen as scanners tracked the path of the probe. It sped straight into the tail of Comet Halley. The probe began sending data and photos to the space station with lightning speed. At the same time, 3 glass tubes at the front of the cabin began to fill with gases. Using special glasses, the crew could see the colorful spectral signatures of the gases found in the comet's tail. Back at Mission Control, Sarah listened excitedly as news of the probe came over the speaker. "Simcom to Capcom. Probe launch was successful. The station is about to shut down. We're coming home." "Welcome back," announced the mission commander, "to the 1990s. You have just successfully completed your simulated mission to Comet Halley. The events that you experienced were based on past and future NASA missions. And even though simulation means the trip wasn't real, your teamwork certainly was." The simulated mission to Comet Halley, set in the year 2061, is reenacted day after day at special sites called Challenger Learning Centers. Housed in museums, science centers, and schools across the nation, each center includes a space station interior and mission control room. In these settings, students and teachers work side by side in teams. Together, they learn to solve math, science, and technology problems during a mock spaceflight. The simulated spaceflights and Challenger Learning Centers are just one part of a broad program sponsored by the Challenger Center for Space Science Education. Founded by the 7 families of the Challenger astronauts, it was created to carry on the unique educational mission of the original crew. When the Space Shuttle Challenger soared into flight on January 28, 1986, students across the nation were watching. Most knew that the crew included the nation's first teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe. Many had prepared for a week of lessons from space. In these lessons, each of the astronauts would conduct in-flight studies about the future space station. Challenger also carried a number of experiments designed by school children. Then came the tragic shuttle explosion, leaving the crew's mission undone. Months later, the families of the astronauts joined together and vowed to complete a vital part of the Challenger mission, to teach, to explore, to inspire. Thus, Challenger Center was born. What has evolved is a powerful network of people, places, and programs. These programs include teacher workshops, classroom teleconferences, and simulated space flights such as Sarah's. It's been over 20 years since the first people walked on the moon. Much progress has been made since then, but there's still a long way to go. Who will be the first person to live on the moon, to walk on Mars, to explore the satellites of Jupiter? It all depends on the young people of today. The grass prickled the backs of Sarah's legs as she looked up into the night sky. She could still see the smile on her teacher's face when Sarah came to class the next day. "Well, Mission Control," Mrs. Rhodes had said, "was the launch a success?" Sarah had explained how she found a new path for the crew's oxygen flow. Mrs. Rhodes didn't seem the least surprised. "And the flight director said I came very highly recommended," laughed Sarah. "You'd think I just graduated from Starfleet Academy." There was a brightness in Mrs. Rhodes' eyes that Sarah had never noticed before. "Mrs. Rhodes," asked Sarah, "how come you look like you already knew all this?" Mrs. Rhodes laughed. "I've always known about your strong problem-solving abilities, Sarah. I'm just pleased that now you know about them, too." Sarah looked up into the sky. Why did the stars look different tonight? Certainly they were brighter. But how odd, she thought, that some stars should look closer than the night before. That big one by the moon, that must be a planet. As Sarah thought about her journey to the edge of space, she reached up one arm toward the bright star. A little farther now, she thought, and I can just about touch it.
Painting the past. It looks like an ordinary house. Tucked behind shade trees on a quiet street, it has a big wooden door with shuttered windows on each side. The neatly trimmed yard is bordered by low shrubs and flowers. Every once in a while, people stroll by. Most of them don't even notice the place. A car pulls into the driveway, and a man gets out. He unlocks the front door and goes inside. A moment later, he walks into the backyard. It's as if he stepped into another world. There are wild grasses and boulders. Trees arch over a small, rugged canyon. The sounds of traffic are gone, replaced by a breeze blowing through the branches. The man follows a path that winds among the boulders. With each step, he leaves the modern world farther behind. Off to one side, a cat pads silently through the grass. The cat stops, eyes glued to a robin. The man watches, then sits on a rock and opens a sketch pad. With a few quick strokes, he draws the arch of the cat's back, the angle of its legs, the glitter in its eyes. "Heather," he calls. The cat turns to look at him, and the robin flutters away. "Time to go to work." The man closes his sketch pad. With Heather following, he makes his way into a low building set back among the trees. It's a cozy place, crowded with strange objects. There are skulls and fossils and animal pelts. There are brushes, paints, and a drawing board. This building is the man's office, and these are his tools. What kind of job does he have? In this small studio on a quiet suburban street, Mark Hallett brings dinosaurs to life. As a young boy, Mark loved going to the museum. He was especially fascinated by fossils, remains of plants and animals from the past. His friends would look at dinosaur fossils and see old bones. Mark would look beyond the bones and try to imagine what the creatures looked like. Did they have skin? Did they have scales like crocodiles? What color were they? Where did they live? How did they move? People who study fossils are called paleontologists. Mark thought of becoming one, but he also wanted a career as an artist. He attended art school where he worked on children's books, fashion magazines, and technical projects. While he worked, he dreamed of dinosaurs. He longed to bring them back to life. And he thought that through his art, he might be able to do just that. After graduating, Mark did some packaging and magazine illustrations. Then one day, a publisher called. "Mark," he said, "we need some paintings for a magazine article. Have you ever thought about drawing dinosaurs?" He'd been waiting a long time for someone to ask him that question. The project went well, and word spread. Before Mark knew it, he had the career he had hoped for. He was a paleo artist. His job was to work with paleontologists and other experts in recreating plants and animals of the past through painted pictures. Today, Mark is beginning a new assignment. The George C. Page Museum in Los Angeles has asked him to do paintings of an extinct saber-toothed cat that lived in California many years ago. Let's follow the project to see what a paleo artist does. The first step is reading, lots of it. Mark gets all the best books and scientific papers he can find on saber-toothed cats. He studies text and diagrams, taking careful notes. Next, he contacts a leading expert at a museum or university. In this case, Mark is learning about the shape and structure of the cat's skull. He is especially interested in the workings of the jaw. How far did it open? How did the cat bite? Details such as this are important if Mark's paintings are to be accurate and lifelike. At this stage, he likes to get a first-hand look at the fossils. The Page Museum is built over tar pits in which animals were trapped many years ago. As a result, the museum has a fine collection of saber-toothed cat bones. Mark spends several hours sketching and taking pictures of the cat's bone structure. His next stop is the museum lab. Here, bones are cleaned, labeled, and stored in metal drawers. Mark talks to the lab manager about the shape of the paws. He studies the paw bones through a magnifying glass and makes more sketches. He even measures the bones, trying to learn exactly what the paws looked like and how they worked. Many times, especially with dinosaurs, complete skeletons of the animal do not exist. In these cases, Mark studies the bones that are available and works with an expert to reconstruct the rest. In this original research, Mark's work is not very different from that of a paleontologist. Mark likes to do his own research, however, because there have been times when the existing skeletons and drawings of an animal have turned out to be wrong. Sometimes, in spite of all the research, there is not enough information to work with. Perhaps there are too few fossils or too few ideas about how the bones fit together. In these cases, Mark does not try any paintings, since they would not be accurate. When his research is finished, Mark goes back to his studio and begins drawing. He always starts with the animal's skeleton. This determines not only the shape of the body, but how the animal stood and moved. In this project, Mark begins with the head of the saber-toothed cat, showing the jaw in opened and closed positions. Once the skeleton drawings are finished, he moves on to the muscles. Unlike the hard bones, the muscles and other soft parts of these animals no longer exist. This is where the detective work begins. Mark studies his clues. He can tell where some of the muscles were located because of scars or rough places on the bones. He then looks for similar marks on the bones of modern-day animals and might use the muscle structure of those animals as a model. He often talks with experts in animal motion or biomechanics. Using all the clues he has gathered for this project, Mark draws the muscles of the saber-toothed cat. His next drawing shows the skin or hide of the animal which covers the muscles. There is more detective work involved here. Again, some of his best clues come from similar modern-day animals. Mark studies pelts from these animals for fur color and texture. In the case of the saber-toothed cat, one of his sources of information was heather. Many modern animals rely on color and markings to help them blend into their environment. Mark feels that ancient animals could have done the same thing. Dinosaurs, for example, may not have been solid gray, brown, or green, as they are often shown. Instead, they might have had stripes or spots in any number of different colors, depending on where they lived. At this stage, Mark's drawings show the subject on the page by itself. The next step is to show the animal in motion in its natural setting. For the saber-toothed cat project, he roams the areas where the great cats lived, taking pictures of the landscape. Then he goes back to his studio and sketches the cat in action, surrounded by the plants and animals of its day. Then and only then does Mark sit down at the drawing board and paint the scene he was hired to do. He uses everything he has learned about the saber-toothed cat: bone structure, muscles, fur, landscape, and motion to create the finished piece. It might be only one painting, but it could represent weeks or even months of hard work. Mark loves painting ancient animals of all kinds, but he finds himself returning again and again to dinosaurs. I like them partly because they're so unusual, he says. But unlike other exotic creatures such as dragons or unicorns, dinosaurs were real. In fact, for years they ruled the earth. Then, suddenly, they were gone. What happened to them? No one really knows. We do know a few things about them. There were many different types and sizes of dinosaur. Some were plant eaters, herbivores, while others were meat eaters, carnivores. Dinosaurs lived in virtually every corner of the world. It appears they migrated, much as whales do today, over hundreds or even thousands of miles. Most people think dinosaurs were a type of lizard, but this is not true. In fact, their closest living relatives are birds. Some scientists even feel that dinosaurs may have had feathers. Again, no one knows for sure. Mark's favorite dinosaurs are the gigantic sauropods, such as the long-necked Mamenchisaurus. Sauropods weighed 50 to 60 tons and stretched out to lengths of up to 100 feet. It's hard to imagine that something so huge could disappear so completely, says Mark. Dinosaurs are extinct, but Mark points out that in our modern world, many animals and wilderness areas can still be saved. He feels that our destruction of the natural world is the most serious problem we face today. Mark does what he can to preserve that world. In the meantime, he continues to paint pictures of a more primitive world and its creatures. His work can be found in museums, books, magazines, posters, and calendars. He is currently a consulting artist for Paramount Pictures and Steven Spielberg, designing dinosaur characters for upcoming films. Young people find themselves attracted to his work because, like Mark, they want to see more than just bones. They want the creatures of the past to live and breathe. And so Mark Hallett will go back into his studio, shut the door, and spend another afternoon in a world that is gone forever. With the help of Mark's paintings, you can join him there.
That's the end of this side.
Please turn the tape over for the next story. Recycling with Sally. I admit that I'm a slob. Somehow I can't seem to pick up my clothes or put my books and tapes in order. I've got junk all over my room. Empty soda cans, magazines, games. The mess really bothers my mom. I've been trying to tell her I'm only 11 years old and have the rest of my life to clean it up. She's not falling for it. We just moved into a new neighborhood. Somehow I've messed up my new room too. I promised to clean it up, but I needed a break after hanging up 5 pairs of jeans. So I grabbed a soda and the funnies from the paper and I went outside. "Hey!" called a voice from across the yard. "May I have that can after you're done?" It was the girl who lived next door. I'd seen her a week earlier, dragging 2 plastic buckets out to the curb. I'd been wondering what was in those buckets. "I'm collecting stuff for the recycling center," she told me. "I've already filled 1 bucket with glass bottles. If you have more cans in your house, we could rinse them out and add them to the bucket for aluminum." Then she added, "Hi, I'm Rosa Molina." I told her my name was Sally Franklin and that we could go look inside. When she saw my bedroom, she laughed. "Your room should be recycled. If everybody treated the earth this way, the planet would be one huge trash heap." "Hey, what's wrong with trash?" I said. "I've been collecting it for 11 years. "Nothing, except there's so much of it that we're running out of places to put it. Did you know that the average American produces about 3½ pounds of garbage every day, which adds up to almost 1,300 pounds a year?" "Who said?" I asked. "My dad. He told me we should reuse things instead of throwing them away. That would save energy and natural resources, like the trees that are used to make paper." "You know what?" she said. "Why don't you come to the recycling center with us? My dad organized a paper drive, and we're going to drop off the newspapers today. I checked with my mom, then left with Rosa and her father for the recycling center. When we got there, Mr. Molina drove his pickup truck onto a scale where it was weighed with the newspapers and us still in it. I learned this was called the laden weight. After a computer showed the laden weight, we drove to a spot where we could unload the papers. Then the three of us got back into the truck and Mr. Molina drove onto the scale again. While we were seated inside, Rosa's dad introduced us to the manager, Mr. Johnson. We watched as Mr. Johnson subtracted the weight of the truck without papers from the weight with papers. The result was called the net weight. It would determine how much money the Molinas would get. "Not every center pays for what you bring in," said Mr. Molina. "The important thing is to recycle, even if you don't get money for it." Before we left the recycling center, Mr. Johnson offered to give Rosa and me a tour. He showed us where the aluminum cans were weighed in wire baskets, then dumped into a machine that flattened them. "Flattened or shredded cans take up less room," he explained, "which means we can ship a lot more cans at one time." Rosa asked, "What happens to the aluminum after it leaves the recycling center?" "It's sent to a place called a smelter," Mr. Johnson said. "There, the aluminum is melted and purified. This liquid metal is poured into a ladle. Then it's cooled, flattened, and rolled into coils. On a single machine, these coils are trimmed, leveled, washed, and coated. An inspector makes sure the coils are perfect before they're shipped to factories that make new cans." Mr. Johnson said the liquid metal is sometimes made into ingots, which look like metal bricks. These are also sent to aluminum can factories. He added, "It takes only 6 weeks for a can to be recycled, from the time it comes to a recycling center to the time it appears again on a store shelf." "Really?" said Rosa. "My dad never told me that. He did say that recycling aluminum saves 95% of the energy to produce new metal. The energy that's saved from recycling one can will run a TV for 3 hours. The Molinas sure seemed smart, but I admit I was having fun and learning a lot." Next, Mr. Johnson told us about recycling glass. He said that glass bottles are weighed, then put into bins. These bins are taken by forklift to larger bins called roll-off containers. Roll-off containers can be attached to a truck cab and driven to a processing center. Mr. Johnson showed us a roll-off container filled with bottles. As we stood beside it, he explained, "At the processing center, the glass is broken into little pieces, called cullet. The cullet is run through a machine that removes any metal pieces with an electromagnet." "Great," said Rosa. "That means we don't have to do it." "That's right," said Mr. Johnson. "The clean cullet is screened and crushed, then mixed with sand, soda ash, and limestone. This mixture is heated in furnaces at about 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit until it melts. Then the molten, or liquid glass, is fed into automatic bottle-forming machines, where it's shaped into containers. The bottles are cooled and then checked." "Trying to sound smart," I asked, "and I suppose recycling glass saves energy too?" "Sure it does," said Mr. Johnson. "Recycled glass melts at a little bit lower temperature, reducing the amount of energy it takes to create new glass. Glass is 100% recyclable. For every ton of used containers melted, a ton of new containers is produced." Next, Mr. Johnson offered to tell us about newspaper recycling. He walked us over to a big mound of papers. "First," he said, Used newspaper has to be taken by truck to a newsprint mill. There the papers are baled and stored, then dumped into piles that are much taller than this one. Rosa said, "I bet they look like newspaper hills." "They do," answered Mr. Johnson, "but not for long, because the newspaper is sent to something called a pulper. It works like a kitchen blender. As warm water is added, huge rotors stir the paper until it breaks down into pulp. Then, chemicals are added, which begin loosening the ink from the paper fibers. Mr. Johnson said that once the ink is loosened, it is washed away from the fibers on large rotating cylinders with screens. Next, it is fed into a paper-making machine, where most of the water is removed and the fibers are formed into a sheet of newsprint. The newsprint is rolled onto spools and inspected for quality, then wrapped for protection and shipped by truck or rail." "I don't want to sound rude," I said, "but instead of recycling, why can't we keep planting more trees?" Mr. Johnson smiled. "We can't grow them fast enough, and like other types of recycling, reusing newspaper saves energy. It also cuts down on air pollution and the amount of garbage that's thrown away." Rosa said, "It takes over 500,000 trees to give us our Sunday newspapers every week." I began to feel guilty about chopping down all those trees just to read the funnies. Rather than stop reading, I decided to start my own recycling program at home. That afternoon, Mr. Johnson gave me plastic buckets for storing glass and aluminum. He told me to bundle the newspapers and stack them underneath the buckets when I brought them out to the curb once a week for pickup. When I got home, I told my mom about my plan. She and I decided to place the buckets under the sink. Then I taped a sign above the sink for everyone to read. It said, "Please rinse cans and bottles for recycling." I thought we'd need this note until we got into the habit of sorting our trash. I also asked my dad to crush the cans so they took up less space. Mr. Johnson had told me to store the newspapers in a clean, dry place, where there wouldn't be any danger of them catching fire. This meant keeping them away from the furnace, water heater, washer, and dryer. We chose a corner of our kitchen where we placed a cardboard box to store neatly folded bundles of newspaper. Later that week, I found some books at the library on recycling. I learned an interesting thing about aluminum. A magnet won't stick to it. Using a magnet is a good way to test whether a can is made of aluminum or not. I wanted to share my books with Rosa, so I invited her over. We went into my room to read. "Look," she said, pointing to one page. "There are other things we can do to protect the environment besides recycling." "You're right," I said, reading over her shoulder. "It says right here that we can create less trash by shopping wisely. We can avoid buying things that are only used once. This includes plastic and styrofoam cups, plates, and containers, which can't be recycled. We can buy in large amounts whenever possible, and we can look for things that don't use fancy packaging, like extra wrappers and plastic." "Wow," I said, looking up from the page. "Can you believe that 1/3 of the average American's trash is made up of packaging that's thrown out as soon as it's opened?" "These books are great," said Rosa. "I bet I can impress my dad with a few things he doesn't know. Look at this chapter. It's about something called compost. It says that a lot of garbage is made up of yard waste, like grass clippings and leaves. Gee, we can use those things in the garden to create fertilizer. And we can add items from the household trash, like potato peels and apple cores. Sally, we have so much to learn and do." I gave her a great big smile. And as long as we're trying to clean up the planet, I might as well start with my room.